comparing to escape from ethnocentrism. And age-old idea of philosophers is that knowledge of the self is gained through knowledge of others. The ego affirms itself by the roundabout way of multiple comparisons. The child developed by imitating or opposing. The very stature of a person original and unique exists only in a relative sense. Hegel clearly states that consciousness recognizes itself in others and knows the other in itself. What is true for the individual is even more so for societies. There is no nation without other nations. This diversity, which actually contributes to the awakening of contrasting national identities, is the only element that permits the perceptions of what characterizes people and system. Let us imagine a country encircled for centuries by an unbreachable wall. Which of its inhabitants would be in a position to describe such a confined nation? What could be the reference point? How could one measure what is perceived? Moreover, what could be perceived limited to a superficial and episodic chronicle? The observer would be incapable of understanding most of the fundamental and pertinent traits of the environment. With what rigidity our social groups constitute, what features characterize the mentality of the populace, to what degree is power centralized. The simple formulation of these questions presupposes comparison. Denied the possibility of looking beyond his or her own world, the analyst is virtually blind. Observers who cultivate a distance between themselves and the society in which they live will find new perspectives opening. It is not by accident that among the finest studies on so many countries we inevitably find the work of a surprisingly uh, perspicacious perspicacious stranger. We can illustrate this proposition by many examples. A Frenchman, Andre Siegfried, half a century ago, perceived how the mentality of the British ruling class should create a uh, crise. Britannic, an Englishman, James Bryce, at the beginning of the century, saw in the America the American Commonwealth how the system of candidate selection for the presidency of the United States could discard first class talents. An American, Edward Winfield, during a relatively brief sojourn in the south of Italy, recorded the rules of behavior for population distribution, distrusting the central power. Later, Italian sociologist confirm the main features of this analysis. At a moment when immoral familism was already in rapid decline, the existence of uh, 4,50,000 municipal councillor in France and is a fact not given uh, great importance by French political scientists, but for a foreigner like Sidney Tarot, it constitutes an extraordinary phenomenon that demands the revision of certain cliches nourished by many Frenchmen. To speak of a lack of participation in a country where one out of every 60 citizen is a member of a municipal council may seem a rapid and somewhat superficial judgment, especially if we look to rural areas. The decay of many American cities was perceived first by non American observers even before World War II. Books written by Europeans analyzed this decline, which scholars from the western side of the Atlantic were so late in discovering. Australian geographers, for their part, marvel at the existence of villages in Europe. The sociologists and the political scientists seems to have taken up the torch of phalanx of illustrious writers such as Kant, Goethe, Stendhal, Ryan, Shelley, who in they discovered at least one country, Italy. Expatriation has always been perceived as a key to more objective judgment. Truth on this side of Pyrrhus, error on the others. Commented first Montaigne, then Pascal. The most commonly accepted values, the most uncontested social structures of political institutions are not necessarily universal. Throughout the 18th century, the pioneering comparativists appear to have been in search of models beyond the channel. Montesquieu, Voltaire, and Diderot discover a political regime that they contrast to monarchical absolutism. With Tocqueville, the analysis turns superior. No longer does the observer look outside to polish weapons for his political combat. Rather, it is to sharpen his insight, to refine his perspectives by contrasting them. Sometime later, the comparativist penetrates a new universe with the end of anthropologist reconsider some accepted generalization and even asking new questions of most familiar environment. Each foray out of his own country resounds like a revelation. You finally understand that there exists a plurality of values, structures, and the system which are not simply product of nature. Such a revelation contains an explosive potential. There would not have been a French Revolution without the British example, or Meiji era without the shock represented by the discovery of the Western world. Behind what they called the big noses, the Japanese did see the vitality of another civilization, one world on other ideas, other behaviors, and other technologies are worthy of imitation. The historian has underlined how confrontations which other societies impose the burden of sometimes dramatically premature collective aspirations and well established regimes. The old world offers multiple illustrations of these disruptive pressures, and it is not surprising that so many countries in the third world now try to protect themselves from what they feel to be dangerous contamination. The contemporary totalitarian states of course, have more ways to fight contagions that the monarchies had during the first part of the 19th century when they tried in vain to protect themselves against the virulent ideas of French Revolution. The regions, however, remains the same. The leaders of well-known empire in the East have managed to restrict not only abstract communications but also the actual movement of the people. They know that certain contexts can be dangerous. Any comparative knowledge risks becoming a factor of change simply because it contains the idea that what was originally perceived as proceeding from region or providence is not an unique and absolute truth. The translated in terms of political demands. The perception of difference is one of the most important levers in history. A powerful, perhaps a social conflict within the nation within the nations at a more prosaic level, and would be easy to provide instances of demands and solution based on foreign examples that are diffused by contingents. We think, for example, of the institutions of ombudsman or the creation of the Ministry of Environment. Considered from a distance, the entire political and social history of Western Europe seems marked by the congruence, as if the entire European continent periodically took the time from the same Big Bang. During the 19th century, many European countries wavered between the British and French models, but soon all countries tended to move to the same wheat, voicing parallel demands for more freedom, more justice, more participation. Universal suffrage was extended at the moment of the unions becomes powerful organizations. Women in the eight countries simultaneously obtained the right to vote. A French student of labor legislation, Paul Lois, noted that if we examine the historical evolution of labor law, we are struck by the fact that it proceeded in all countries along the same successive stage. In the aftermath of the World War II, the nations of Western Europe held similar institutions for social security, welfare, retirement, family allocations. They gave the state increased means of intervention and economic life. For nearly half a century, Western democracies on both sides of the Atlantic have used fiscal means to increase progressively in that part of GNP controlled by the government. By the early 1980s, the most liberal governments of the West collected and redistributed about 40% of the national product. At the present time, it is difficult to determine whether the budget cutting endeavors of conservative leaders in the US and Europe will mark a reversal of the tendency or not. An international communication develops so does synchronization. Agitation is in one country awakens public opinion in the next, and the idea make their way. One country drove the voting age to 18 and 5 or 6 others siege upon the change. Legislation to protect the natural environment, to ease restrictions on birth control, and to adopt laws on divorce by consent was formulated and implemented about the same time in the France and Germany. The social reforms enacted in Italy during the first post-war decade was modeled on those of France. Political leaders are themselves vectors of this parallelism. This is obvious in the third world countries where an entire generation of rulers uh, tries to impose upon the masses ideas of and models forged in advanced countries. Whether Eastern or Western, it is even more true of European nations, tied together by strikingly similar economic and social problems. They tend to adapt solutions that are apparently beneficial in neighboring countries. The process of comparison becomes heuristics. It suggests political platforms being clear that such mimicry does not guarantee that worthy solution is in one place are necessarily appropriate in another. A similar cure of liberalism will not result in the same benefit in Great Britain and in Japan. The capacity of the French social structures and organizations to regularize the functioning of a free market is probably not equal to that of the German system. Prescription, a marvelous prescription is probably not uh, here does not necessarily provide good result elsewhere. But an essential contribution of scientific comparison is precisely to set light on the importance of original context, which actively assimilate the variable introduced. Comparison is the engine of knowledge. Because of the comprehensions of a single case is linked to the understanding of many cases, because we perceive that particular better in the light of generalities, International comparison increases tenfold the possibility of explaining political phenomena. The observer who studies just one country could interpret as normal what in fact appears to the comparativist as abnormal. Even that which is most familiar can escape perception. Was ist banked ist nicht erkannt, underlined Hegel. The problem is not merely to evaluate the venality or the singularity of this kind of the phenomena. The discovery of extraordinary invites the observer to try to explain why the rules that exist here and absence there, and vice versa. The historian would seek the reason for this and that uncommon delay in mobilization. The demographer would ask why fertility here or there is not affected by urbanizations. The political scientist seeks the reason for instability in a particular context by progressively eliminating variables that do not produce instability elsewhere. The juxtaposition of cases is useful not only to situate each one in relation to others also, but because it calls for generalizations, those white melting pots that turn each particular experience into an exemplar and deviant or clinical case, allowing in return a wider understanding even of what is specific. Although comparisons may initially appear to be a quest for information, it also represents a quest for enlightenment, and thus as, it is one of the most fruitful ways of thinking. It helps to rid us of inherited fossilized notions, obli- obliges us to reconsider the validity of undiscussed interpretations, and enlarge us, our visual field. Every researcher, even a comparativist researcher, belongs to a culture and that can limit his or her capacity to perceive. These blankers have not been easily recognized. Sociologists from the West have been so slow to realize that they were talking their own measures of for universal ones. For a long time, for a long time, classic comparisons. For a long time, classic comparisons have implicitly incorporated the idea of progress, tending to consider each political system according to the place it occupied on an imaginary scale, leading inexorably to development, democracy, or even westernization. It is a natural risk, which, when one compares to fall into ethnocentrism, and comparison may be the best antidote to this danger. Irresistibly. The perception of contrast makes researchers sensitive to the relativity of knowledge and consequently help liberate them from culture cells. Indeed, very concept of ethnocentrism simply cannot exist without the comparative exercise. Only with exposure to other cultures does no one become conscious of possible intellectual occultation, as Ali Helby noted long ago. The differences between the France and England and enormous for Europeans, a minimal indeed to the inhabitant of Peking or Calcutta. The perception of differences is a function of proximity of the observer, a fact that can raise problems. When researchers succeed in establishing a close relationship with a subject culture, the only dimensions they really value is often that of specificity, specifically. For example, the works of Jack Work, who studied the other world from within, offer the reader an exceptional pa- panorama of an original reality. But it is so original that a comparison becomes unattainable. As Edwards said, asserts difficulty with most writings about Islamic countries is that they overemphasize their peculiarities, with the result that these writings deal more with the specificity of culture than with the comparisons. The intimate perception of a social universe, even if by a foreigner, thus results in one precious quality, a lifelike knowledge obtained through subjective complicity. But it is not a life. It is not always useful for generating comparisons and does not facilitate the induction from specific to general, which alone allows knowledge to progress. Studying the Arab world and considering the same transition to modernity, Daniel Lerner in his book The Passing of Traditional Society perhaps commits the sin of excessive generalization. But such a sin could be considered minor in comparison to the over specificity of so many experts. The objective of comparative sociology and political science and their efforts to become more explanatory than descriptive is precisely to insert each study partial, regional, sectoral into a larger context. The historian Paul Wayne went so far as to say paradoxically that even a specific and individual knowledge passes through uh, conceptual generalizations. It is necessary to conceive the imperialism in general in order to perceive what is particular about Roman imperialism, British colonial imperialism, Soviet imperialism by satellite, or American economic imperialism. Only what remains constant individualizes, no matter how abstract and general it be. Put differently, one needs the concept of Gothic cathedral to appreciate what is what is original about the cathedrals of Burgos, Milan, and Marburg, Strasbourg, or Cologne, and their search for pertinent categories. Social scientists have tried to rid themselves of the normative visions peculiar to these societies. How are we to measure participation, democracy, or freedom if we retain criteria that are particular to a certain political system? Some researchers from Eastern Europe, for example, Georgi Viarcher, have cited the difficulties of the communication between Western scholars and their colleagues from East. This normative bias is manifested even among Western comparativists. Charles Moscos and Wendell Well have denounced some pernicious ideas that democracy is inappropriate for poor people, for instance, or that military governments are more efficient than other at a given stage of development. But how to conceive of a totally objective researchers to be conscious of the values one holds may be more fruitful than to pretend to be totally free from preconceptions. The contribution of anthropology to the release of political science from narrow and cultural limits should be mentioned here. The study of primitive societies has have permitted social scientists to comprehend their own universe in a different light. The integration of primitive groups into the recognized corpus of a social system has obliged them to drawbacks and elaborate more universal categories. It is not by accident that the functionalism descends directly from anthropology. Some authors, such as Jean Ziegler, have even proposed starting from the non-Western in order to return to the Western equipped with a new concept. With this strategy has been criticized and excessive by Giovanni Sartori. It is ridiculous to speak of political participation in Uganda or Yemen as it is to explain the function of advanced pluralistic democracies in terms of mobilization. One should not attempt to overcome one ethnocentrism by falling into another. And the best of hypotheses, the concepts will be swollen out of all proportions. They will be softened to such a degree that they will lose their accuracy even for the particular countries in which they were born. All in all, it can hardly be held that our losses of a specificity are compensated by the gains in inclusiveness. I would rather say that our gain in traveling capacity or in universal exclusiveness are verbal and receptive, while our gains in of obfuscation are very substantial. Sartori's critique is addressed to those who make indiscriminate use of what we have learned from non-Western societies. Nevertheless, one should not neglect how much some pages from anthropology have uh, animated comparative political science. Parallels developed by Claude Lévi-Strauss between myths and ideologies and anthropologies structure have fertilized the analysis of both myths and ideologies. The research of William Mohlman and his colleagues on nativism has nourished the comprehension of nationalism, and the same way an analysis of messianism cannot be ignored by those interested in charismatic or revolutionary phenomena. George Valentier has rightly stressed how much the debate over power and politics in general have been stimulated by anthropological approach. Sociology has also played an important role in pointing out the dangers of ethnocentrism. Societies across the world are infinitely varied to account for the contrast they observe between the behavior of Poles and Italians, Irish and black people. Sociologists from the Chicago School at the beginning of the century gave birth to the concept of culture. They were among the first to emphasize how diverse societies are, how resistant and significant are the psychological frontiers imposed on them by history. A few decades later, Western social scientists, American and European, began invading the four corners of the world armed with erudite questionnaires. They rapidly discovered with bitterness the inefficiency of the universal concept. Questions that were full of meaning in England or Scandinavia were struck the Japanese and could not be translated into Arabic, but these obstacles have stimulated serious reflection and have undeniably favored progress and maturation. To warn that a question of or a research tool does not fit as an Irvin Swake does signifies that the researcher from foreign culture is usually unaware of essential basis of his own thinking. Thus, the pains involved in doing cross-cultural research or reflection of every character and cross-cultural research is supposed to provide for a social science developing by the particular social system. Comparative studies point out and denounce ethnocentrism, and in this way, they certainly contribute to its lessening. One must test one's own limits in order to transcend them like any scientific discipline. International comparisons will progress by correcting a series of errors progressively revealed.